Okay, let's unpack this. Um, when you picture a fantasy dungeon, what comes to mind? Like stone corridors, a few monsters maybe, some
Yes.
traps.
Yeah, maybe some gold if you're lucky.
Exactly. A pretty self-contained kind of challenge, right? Well, we've just been on a deep dive into a stack of sources, and honestly, they suggest that simple image misses, well, a lot.
It really does. These sources, they push way beyond that idea of a dungeon as just, a static location. They get into the surprising complexity under the surface.
Like what kind of complexity?
Things like the absolutely bizarre economics involved in building these places, the really profound ways they can act as catalysts that reshape an entire world.
Wow.
And even how the culture around games like D&D is kind of tangled up with real-world economic systems is fascinating stuff.
So we're looking at essays that treat dungeons almost like dynamic forces, things that can warp political and even physical reality.
Exactly, and deep dives into the, frankly, ridiculous finances behind actually constructing an underground lair, plus analyses connecting role-playing games to big ideas like capitalism and uh, how we see ourselves today.
Okay, so our mission with this deep dive is basically to pull out the most important nuggets for you. We want to show why these spaces are way more than just rooms and monsters.
Yeah, they're potentially complex detonators of consequence, baffling monuments to impracticality, and maybe surprisingly, mirrors of how we live and work. We're here to unpack the layers of meaning and some genuinely unexpected facts buried in this material.
All right, let's start with one of the most compelling ideas from the sources.
hmm
The dungeon as a world-tilting detonator. Forget the contained challenge idea for a minute.
Exactly. The traditional view often saw a dungeon as, you go in, you clear it, you leave. The impact is mostly inside its walls. But one source really argues against this, saying a dungeon isn't a container, it's a detonator.
A detonator. That's a fascinating metaphor. So when adventurers step inside, they're not just opening a door,
They're pulling a pin. That's the phrase used. It ignites a chain reaction. And this isn't just traps inside the dungeon going off. The consequences ripple outwards into the wider campaign world, politically, ecologically.
spiritually, mythically even.
Right. The dungeon becomes a fulcrum tilting the campaign world. The sources actually use the classic D&D GDQ series giants, Draw, Queen of the Demon Web Pits, as a perfect example of this escalating impact.
Oh, those classics. G13, D13, and Q1. Yeah, I remember the sheer scale of that series. It just kept growing.
It starts pretty simply, doesn't it?
Right.
G1, hill giants raiding farms, a local conflict, basically a border problem.
Small scale, pretty low stakes at first glance.
But then G2 and G3 show it's not isolated, it's organized.
Yeah.
It points downwards, subterranean. D1 confirms that the giant raids are part of bigger Underdark unrest manipulated from below.
Okay, so it escalates from a local nuisance to a regional underworld threat. The scope is widening.
Then D3 plunges the party right into the heart of Drow society. You're not just fighting random monsters anymore, you're actively disrupting a complex civilization. That's like full-blown infiltration.
And the final step, Q1. You end up invading the literal divine realm of Lolth, the drow goddess herself.
Mythic confrontation. What began as giants stealing cattle ends with adventurers potentially challenging a deity, reshaping the cosmic order. That's the dungeon chain acting as a detonator. It turns a skirmish into possible cosmic regime change.
Wow. So even if maybe the original designers were just focused on making things harder as you went,
Right, Gygax was famously about difficulty.
they inherently built in the potential for those massive consequences. They built the fuse, basically.
Precisely. The sources also talk about different dungeon typologies, how they function almost like ecologically within the world. Think of them as key structures that support or mess with the environment around them.
Tell me about these types. What are they?
Okay, so there's the tumor model. This type spreads corruption or negative effects outwards. Think of the death curse and tomb of annihilation radiating from the dungeon. Clearing it helps, but the damage is already done.
Yeah, the lingering rot. Nasty. Okay, what else?
Then you have the battery. It stores energy or magic, like the wild magic tied up in Barovia. If you mess with its core, you might just unleash all that stored power, maybe uncontrollably.
Right, unpredictable energy release. Got it.
A prison is pretty straightforward. It confines a threat, like a Sarek in Tomb of Horrors, but defeating the Guardian or breaking the prison doesn't destroy the threat's potential, does it? It might just release it, maybe onto the whole world stage.
Oh, yeah. Definitely have to be careful what you unleash.
And finally, the myth structure. Think of a temple anchoring powerful forces or narratives. Destroying it isn't just clearing a location. It can cause wild magic surges or even alter the metaphysical gravity of a region. basically change the rules of reality nearby. The Temple of Elemental Evil gets mentioned here.
So the function of the dungeon, its type, defines its impact, not just what's inside.
And that function is also tied to its symbolic and social dimensions. Is it a lost tomb with royal secrets? A bandit hideout connected to a corrupt noble? Its symbolic weight and social links determine how its clearing or its secrets getting out resonates. Even a tiny goblin lair could spark a trade war if it turns out the local lord was funding them, right?
Right, exactly. The fallout depends on those connections.
Now, the sources do acknowledge that simple, contained dungeons exist. They're fine for low-prep fun, but they argue even those carry latent potential. The old-school Renaissance, OSR, and sandbox games often really lean into this interconnectedness, emphasizing consequences.
So the designers, maybe they didn't always script the exact fallout, but they built a potential for it right into the dungeon structure and place in the world.
And this loops back to you, the player. Your choices, your agency in exploring and clearing these places, that's key. It's not just combat. It's often a political act if you uncover secrets, ecological if you disrupt something, spiritual if you're dealing with gods or curses.
Your choices shape what happens next.
Hmm.
Do you claim the throne? Seal the rift? Expose the conspiracy? Or just walk away? The sources argue giving players clear stakes makes the detonation feel like a shared story.
And the story absolutely keeps going after the dungeon's cleared. They talk about the ghosts of victory. Cleared dungeons aren't just empty rooms. They linger as scars and seeds. Who fills the power vacuum? Does the cult you defeated have followers seeking revenge? Are there weird magical aftershocks?
Like in Curse of Strahd, okay, you defeat him maybe, but Barovia's still there. Does a good leader step up, or does something even worse move in?
Precisely that scenario. And modern RPGs are increasingly designed with this stuff explicitly in mind, using tools like faction clocks to track shifting power, or campaign books detailing the fallout. They're designing dungeons more like dynamic systems, not just one-off challenges.
The sources even mention specific tools for game masters, right? Legacy tables to generate consequences, consequence clocks for tracking slow burn effects, even thinking about dungeon regrowth, like who moves in after the adventurers leave.
Yeah, it's about understanding the dungeon as this piece of mythic infrastructure, and altering it changes the whole landscape.
The core takeaway seems to be, the dungeon isn't the end of the story. It's often the catalyst that kicks off the real story. The one about consequences, power shifts, and changing realities outside its walls.
That's it, exactly.
That's a really compelling way to reframe it. From just a treasure hunt to potentially a world-shaking event. Okay, speaking of the world outside, let's shift gears completely. To something just as surprising maybe, but for totally different reasons. The economics. The sheer cost of building these underground layers.
Ah, yes. Brace yourself for the invoice that broke a kingdom. This section of the sources dives into the utterly, wonderfully absurd question. Who commissioned these architectural nightmares, and, what did it cost?
I'm just picturing some poor master builder, Master Hammerton from the sources, getting handed blueprints for, like, spiral staircases that lead into solid rock, or hallways that double back 40 times for no reason.
That's exactly the vibe. And the sources paint such a vivid picture of the patrons behind this madness. You've got the megalomaniacal wizard, Lord Vexatious. He builds purely to show off how clever he is through bizarre architecture, budget, basically unlimited. He just transmutes lead to gold. But he's a nightmare client, constant absurd changes.
Could you just make this hallway feel a bit more conceptually unsettling?
Pretty much. Or the paranoid noble house, House Crankshaft. They're building layers of nonsensical defensive architecture that's so confusing even they get lost in it, all while hemorrhaging the family fortune. Security through total self-inflicted disorientation.
And then there's the bored immortal, like Lich Lord Bonehammer. For him, it's an endless, obsessive hobby. Time means nothing, right? But the cost of raiding caravans just to fund Revision 48 of the Eastern Wing, that still adds up.
These aren't just buildings. They're physical manifestations of some serious psychological issues, funded by crime, magic, or just mountains of wealth being poured into a literal hole in the ground.
And the workforce. The sources call it the stonemason's lament. Can you imagine working on this stuff? Their list of grievances includes architecturally impossible features.
Getting paid in cursed gold.
Dealing with workplace safety violations like, and this is specific, pit traps installed while workers are still on site.
Yeah, Master Hammerton's daily reports are apparently legendary. Client wants the same spiral staircase to go both up and down simultaneously. Client suggests just making an underground river. Client complains the dungeon isn't confusing enough. The stress must have been unbelievable. The sources mention therapeutic services for masons suffering architectural PTSD.
I can absolutely see that. Trying to build load-bearing illusions. That'd break anyone.
And looking at the sheer economics, the comparison is just stark. A standard practical basement, maybe 500 gold pieces. This kind of architectural fever dream. The sources estimate like 47,000 gold pieces in climbing, even for a modest one. The cost per usable square foot is described as being like the GDP of a small village.
And the labor costs. Stonemasons quitting or literally getting lost inside the construction site. Labor is just disappearing. Architects drinking heavily to cope. Withered consultants paid a fortune just to explain basic physics.
Don't forget the army of torchbearers needed just to find your way around the construction zone.
Plus the ongoing costs. It doesn't stop when it's built. Ongoing maintenance, replacing torches, repairing damage from confused residents or, adventurers, hiring guides for the owner. And that therapy budget for the survivors.
So the real question the sources tackle is why? Why build something so insanely expensive and impractical?
What are the theories?
Well, psychological ones like complexity addiction, immortal boredom theory, or just plain intimidation through confusion make it so weird nobody dares enter.
More economic theories?
Like the sunken cost fallacy, you've spent so much you feel you have to keep going. Or just the status symbol, my maze is bigger and more pointlessly confusing than yours. And my personal favorite, the surprisingly practical tax avoidance scheme, claiming it's a defensive fortification to write off the absurd costs.
Claiming a hallway that literally weeps at 2 a.m. as a tax write-off. That's some next-level financial maneuvering. Genius-level depravity, maybe.
And the victims aren't just the adventurers. The confused visitors, sure, but also the staff. The sources mention unionized dungeon staff. Can you believe it?
Unionized dungeon staff. Okay, now I've heard everything.
And the poor neighbors, dealing with plummeting property values because the house next door now has corridors that defy geometry and people occasionally emerge speaking in tongues.
I love the absurd invoice line items they pulled out. Corridor that leads nowhere. Premium confusion grade, 1200 Trine P.
Staircase repair after a client changed mind about up versus down.
Hazard pay for workers lost in construction zone. It's just pure financial insanity.
And apparently this isn't just a one-off weirdo patron, it's practically an industry. There are dungeon consulting firms specializing in architecturally hostile environments.
Like Thrombus and Hex, their philosophy is inefficient flow. And their motto, what was it? If visitors aren't questioning their life choices within the first corridor, we haven't done our job.
And they offer an existential crisis package, designing layouts based on the client's childhood trauma. Their only regret, quoted directly, only that we didn't charge more.
Of course. Of course that's their only regret. And the voices from the trenches section was amazing. The drafter who accidentally drew a staircase spelling the client's name in Draconic.
The foreman who now physically flinches when he sees grid paper.
The torchbearer who got lost for 8 months and claims he visited other planes of existence. It just paints such a vivid, hilarious picture of this whole insane undertaking.
And current trends in dungeon design. Even more absurd. The infinite pantry loops forever, only contains onions, apparently leads to civilizations of one weeping adventurer.
Or the Schrödinger vault, which is simultaneously locked and unlocked until observed, causing quantum uncertainty and, naturally, an insurance crisis.
Do not observe signs on the vault doors.
The sobbing hallway, acoustically engineered for maximum weeping at 2 a.m., leading to constant noise complaints from the deeper levels. Or recursive architecture rooms containing smaller versions of themselves. It's madness as an art form.
And then there's the Underdeep Homeowners Association, with rules like no excessive ambient screaming, fines for improper trap placement, etiquette evaluations for sentient doorways.
And their dues fund collective curse management. They're even being sued by the Adventurers Union. It's just layer upon layer of bureaucratic absurdity.
And speaking of unions, we have to mention the Monsters Union, Local 666. Their report, The Laboring Darkness, argues that maintaining a truly haunted atmosphere requires significant labor. They're demanding break rooms with decent crypt coffee.
Paid possession leave.
And a strict no staff-harming traps policy. Their grievances included stuff like scheduling conflicts between the Fire Demon's yoga class and the cultist summoning rituals.
Suggestive creaks that violated atmosphere standards. A hallway that looped back to the ghoul's own spine.
And the final kicker. Lord Vexatious apparently fled the dimension not because of heroes, but due to a class action soul reclamation suit filed by his undead janitors, mimic staff, disgruntled cultists, and a gelatinous cube.
Oh my god. Sued by the gelatinous cube. That's the peak. And the note about the author trying to find the bathroom only to discover it was merely a philosophical concept?
The sheer depth of the absurdity in these sources is just astounding. It's a monument to wasted resources, pathological design, and surprisingly complex labor relations.
It certainly paints a very, very different picture of the dungeon than just rooms and monsters. Okay. From world-tilting detonators and architectural nightmares. Let's move to our final section. This one connects these fantasy worlds back to our own in some really profound, maybe even uncomfortable ways. How games, capitalism, and even our own sense of self or subjectivity are deeply linked.
Yeah, this is maybe the most complex part of the deep dive. It shifts from the in-world stuff, the mechanics and economics, to look at the relationship between RPGs and real-world systems. The sources argue it's not just a metaphor. They call it a symbiotic machine, a kind of coevolution rooted in shared cultural conditions.
Shared cultural conditions, exactly.
They point specifically to the neoliberal turn starting around the 70s and 80s. You know, that societal shift emphasizing individual responsibility, competition, treating everything like a market. RPGs emerged right alongside this. And the argument is they became these cultural technologies, almost like rehearsal spaces for developing the entrepreneurial self, that mindset of optimizing yourself, being competitive, the kind of logic this new landscape demanded.
So the very act of playing games focused on individual character growth, getting resources, overcoming challenges that could, in a way, mentally prepare you for a world that was becoming more individualistic and competitive. Is that the idea?
That's the core argument, yeah. They kind of grew up together, influencing each other. This led to significant cross-pollination. Think about the 90s and 70s. Stuart Butterfield, founder of Flickr, Slack, he explicitly said he translated game design principles into his tech companies. Things like persistent worlds, gamified interaction.
Wow, that's fascinating. Gaming ideas directly shaping Silicon Valley.
Absolutely. And tech companies started borrowing game mechanics wholesale. Employee advancement structured like character leveling, achievement systems, leaderboards, variable rewards, just like loot drops. That all came from games.
Yeah, you see that everywhere now.
At the same time, games, especially MMOs, got incredibly complex. They became like synthetic worlds, almost economic laboratories where you could test real-world economic models.
So it became a feedback loop. Games influencing work design, work structures influencing game design.
And by the 2010s, with smartphones and what they call platform capitalism, it became full integration. Gaming psychology, often brought in by consultants and academics, got deeply embedded into app design, how platforms treat users, basically collapsing the distinction between playing and working. Users end up being treated as both players and products.
It kind of explains why scrolling through a work app or social media can feel weirdly addictive, right?
Yeah.
Chasing metrics, those little rewards.
Exactly. And the sources argue that specific RPG mechanics of mutual reinforcement help internalize that capitalist logic just through the act of playing.
How does that work specifically? Can you break that down?
Okay, take individual optimization. In many RPGs, you're laser focused on building your character, right? Increasing stats, getting better gear. The game encourages you to see your character as a set of attributes to be made more efficient. Playing this over and over, the argument goes, can subtly encourage you to view yourself through a similar lens in the real world, optimizing your skills, your resume, your personal capital.
Treating yourself like a character sheet. Okay, I can sort of see that connection.
Then there's resource scarcity logic. Games often create artificial scarcity, limited gold, rare items you have to grind for, finite experience points. This makes competition feel natural, almost inevitable, and trains you to prioritize efficiency in getting those limited resources. That's a core principle in capitalist markets, right?
Yeah, the constant grind for that one rare drop definitely mirrors some real-world feelings of scarcity and competition.
Now, the sources are clear. This isn't some kind of conspiracy theory. Playing these games produces genuine pleasure, real fun. The potential problem they highlight is that this can channel our capacity for creativity, for problem solving, for collaboration, towards reproducing the very structures of exploitation they critique. They bring in Foucault's idea of subjectification versus subjection.
Okay, what's that?
It's how systems create capable, active subjects, people who can do things, but then channel that capacity towards being subjected to extraction, making us productive, but in ways that primarily benefit the system. They call it the productivity paradox.
So our fun, our ability to engage with complex systems, might be getting channeled in ways that actually reinforce the economic structures being criticized.
Yeah.
That's a heavy thought. Are we just trapped in this machine then? Is there any way out?
The sources offer a pretty nuanced answer here. They talk about Opportunities for refusal, grains of grit in the machine.
Mhm.
But they explicitly reject the heroic framework, meaning the idea that we need one big hero, one massive revolution, one dramatic breakthrough to fix everything. Instead, they suggest embracing something called strategic smallness.
Strategic smallness. What does that actually look like?
It's thinking of refusal not as a single grand act, but as an ongoing practice. Creating small spaces alongside the dominant systems. It's not trying to destroy them head on, because direct resistance often just strengthens the opposition. And it's not trying to escape entirely, because the sources argue there's no pure outside to escape to. It's also, importantly, not a moral judgment on what others are doing.
Okay, so if it's not revolution and it's not escape, what is it?
They describe it as an ecology of small acts. Things like local experiments, starting a small community garden, running a local tool library, that kind of thing. Selective participation, engaging with the system only where you really need to, or where it's beneficial, not giving it your whole energy or enthusiasm. Building cultural commons, creating shared resources outside market logic, like open source software, community archives, zine libraries, and practicing mutual aid building support networks that aren't based on transactions.
And the grit and the gears metaphor comes in here.
Yeah. The idea is that lots of small accumulated acts create friction. They don't stop the machine entirely, but they can slow it down, create unexpected spaces, introduce unpredictability. It's distributed. Different people contribute different kinds of grit. It lowers the pressure from needing to be a hero to just needing to be, a grain of sand contributing to friction.
It sounds a bit like that phrase, learning to breathe underwater, accepting partial positions.
Exactly that. One source uses the phrase, swimming in the sewer, which is pretty evocative. You can't escape complicity entirely. It's about strategic realism, not moral relativism. The goal isn't achieving personal purity, it's relative improvement, creating slightly more breathable spaces within the system.
And doing it together. Swimming in formation,
Yeah.
as they put it.
Crucial. Community support makes refusal sustainable over the long haul. Shared analysis helps you even see the system's rules more clearly. Distributed practice helps normalize alternative ways of doing things. And these small refusals can create unexpected network effects, spreading and compounding in ways you can't predict.
And this brings us back to gaming itself.
Yeah.
Gaming as a potential site of refusal through critical play practice.
Right. Experimenting with game rules at your table.
Yeah.
Centering care and collaboration instead of just competition. Using collective decision-making processes. Creating those small, temporary spaces for exploring different social relations right there. Community-centered gaming events can function as mutual aid. Using tools like ludic materialism, basically, analyzing what the game mechanics are really teaching us, can be part of it too.
It seems like these practices, while valuable, have clear limits, though. They're not going to magically fix huge systemic issues on their own.
The sources are very clear about that. They absolutely cannot solve everything, and there's always a risk they get co-opted or turned into just another form of consumerism. But their value, the argument goes, is in sustaining individuals and communities, building resilience, and making other forms of necessary political or social work possible.
And finding, what do they call it, sustainable hope in dark times.
Yeah.
Not waiting for some magical fix, some cruel optimism, but finding modest hope.
Yeah, hope that scaled to small groups, focused on the process of building alternatives rather than just the outcome, accepting partial success. It's about living in the ruins, finding ways to create life and meaning within the systems we have, not just waiting for them to collapse or be swept away. It requires the long view, understanding that real change often comes from slow accumulation and network effects over decades, and recognizing that the machine, whatever it is, isn't permanent.
The sources leave us with this really potent idea, tying it back to fantasy. Even in fantasy worlds of infinite possibility, games impose artificial scarcity. The fantasy setting provides ideological distance. The game is not over. The rules can still be changed.
It's a really powerful place to end that whole section, connecting the fantasy back to the potential for change.
Okay, wow. That was quite a journey. We started deep inside classic dungeons and somehow ended up thinking about the structure of capitalism and consciousness itself.
It truly was a deep dive, and it went into some really unexpected territory, didn't it?
Definitely. We saw how those classic dungeons aren't just static rooms, but potential detonators capable of triggering world-changing consequences, escalating from maybe a local conflict right up to cosmic battles. The GDQ series was such a perfect example of that latent potential.
Then we plunged into the absolutely mind-boggling, almost comical economics of building these elaborate, impractical underground layers, exploring the frankly pathological motivations of the patrons, the sheer absurdity of the costs involved, and the hilariously specific grievances of the workforce, and even the Monsters Union.
Right, demanding decent crypt coffee. And finally, we explored that really complex symbiotic relationship between role-playing games and capitalism, seeing how games can sometimes function as these unintentional training grounds for certain ways of thinking about efficiency, competition, while simultaneously offering these vital spaces for resistance, for critical play, for building alternative communities at the gaming table, like those undercommons you mentioned.
Yeah, some of the most surprising takeaways for me were that idea of the dungeon as a geopolitical fulcrum, the sheer financial and psychological toll of architectural absurdity, the Monsters Union demanding paid possession leave, and this concept of using gaming tables as sites for resistance through strategic smallness, creating that grit in the gears of larger systems.
It definitely makes you look at both dungeons and games differently.
Yeah.
And perhaps, as those sources suggest, even your own life a bit differently too. Which brings us to that final provocative thought. The sources state, quite simply, the game is not over. The rules can still be changed.
But, and this feels important, they suggest this isn't about finding that single hero or achieving some total escape from the systems we find ourselves in. It's more about patience rather than drama, accumulation rather than breakthrough, and building networks rather than heroes.
So maybe the question for you listening is, think about the systems you inhabit in your own life, your work, your hobbies, your communities. How might you start to spot the rules that are operating within them, maybe unconsciously?
And following from that, what small acts of strategic smallness, what contributions of grit in the gears might actually be possible for you? Not necessarily to bring the whole machine crashing down, but maybe just to create a little more space for meaningful work or mutual support or just some alternative possibility right where you are.
What would it mean in those systems you're part of to simply refuse the invitation to your own commodification?
Something to ponder, perhaps, long after the torches have gone out in the dungeon or the dice have been put away at the table.